Hi guys, it's Kelly Latevola and I'm here for my very first video for Hero Arts. I am super excited to share some masking and some coloring with you today. I'm going to be using the Protea flowers as well as the Deco pattern stencil just to put a little bit of pattern behind my images. So I'm going to use my MISTI to do some stamping. I removed the grid paper. I like using just the foam. And then I'm going to start with my largest flower first. Anytime you're doing something that is one layer, whatever you want to see all of is the first thing that you want to stamp. So for me, that's my biggest flower. I'm going to use the Hero Arts Intens-ified black ink. It's Copic safe since I am going to be coloring them up with my Copic markers. So I'm going to stamp this down, and then I hadn't stamped any of my masks yet. So I have a small piece of masking paper that I'm going to put down. This particular masking paper has a backer to it, which is actually going to be a benefit to me later on when I'm being lazy. So I'm going to stamp down my large flower and then the smaller flower that's included in the set as well. I'll be stamping 2 of those. So just going to stamp this down and then move my little bar so that I can stamp my other flower on my masking paper, and then I will trim these out, just fussy cut them. I do a lot of masking. I love one layer images. I love making one layer images look super dimensional. It's kind of my happy place. So I'm going to go ahead and just cut these down into 2 smaller pieces. That typically makes fussy cutting easier the smaller the piece is, so that way there's no pulling on the paper. I'm going to go ahead and trim these out, and then once they're all trimmed out, I'll just peel the backer off and put down the image to cover this up. Now you'll notice on the bottom, the way that these stems end, they just kind of gradually kind of end off. There's no necessary line, and I did leave an extra little piece on the bottom of it, and I wish I would not have, but everybody makes mistakes there and everything is fixable. So I was able to fix it in the end where it didn't stamp these flowers. You'll see it leaves like a blank spot because we're masking, right? So I'm going to go ahead and stamp this down. And then for this one, I'm going to remove this, but I'm going to keep the backer paper once I get my fingernail in there. I'm going to keep the backer paper because I have the backer paper, I don't have to use, I don't have to create another mask that I have to fussy cut out. So once I get this second flower in position and stamp it down, I'm going to double check that my backer paper, that I'm using the right side, because you want it to line up accordingly, and since it's just the backer piece, there's no image on it to delineate which side is which. So once I know what side I need to put my glue on, I'm going to use Tombow Mono Multi Glue. This type of glue is a little bit special because it is repositionable when it's dry. So the trick to this is, especially if you're going to be doing any ink blending, is when you put the glue down, make sure you're using your finger or some other tool to smear it all the way out to the edges. I'm going to tap it on my hand a few times just to make sure it's only tacky, because Tombow Mono Multi Glue is also permanent if you put it down wet. And I just want it to be as a mask. I started with the pattern, the stencil, I also use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue on. And again, because it is repositionable when it's tacky, it keeps me from having to tape my stencils down, and I can reuse this several times. A lot of people ask me how I store them. I just stick them back to the acetate packaging that they came in, and they'll stick there until I need to peel them off and use them again. Again, before you put it on your paper, make sure you're tapping it on your hands just to make sure it's just tacky and not still really wet. Gonna put this piece down, and then I'm just gonna use some Salty Ocean Distress ink. I am always starting on my masks and then making small circles to the outside. That way I'm not getting any like the big round pattern on my background. I don't like a lot of pattern. I like a little bit. I like enough to create interest. So after I did the stenciling, I did add more blue to create more of a tone-on-tone pattern. But if you like a bolder pattern, that's totally fine. You can do the high contrast of the blue and white or whatever color it is that you would like to put in your background. Blue is my boyfriend, so I have a natural gravitation towards blue. You can also do this in the reverse order, where you can put the blue ink down and then put the stencil on top of it and ink it so that it's a little bit darker. I'm also going to be using these Glimmer metallic inks. They come in sets. I'm using the silver and gold and the blue and purple. I'm actually only going to be using the silver and blue. These have such a beautiful shimmer to them, and I love all things glittery. So I'm going to mix them with a little bit of water, and then I'm just going to kind of spatter them on my background. Again, this is to create just a little bit of interest going on. They have two different types of shimmer because one is blue based and one is a really true silver. The silver is definitely a more opaque color, but I love them both, and I think that they add a little extra something to the background. One thing to note when you're removing your masks, the backer paper portion, the ink isn't going to dry on that because it's a non-porous surface. So, I mean, I suppose if you waited overnight, maybe it would dry, but I didn't wait that long. I waited long enough for it to absorb in the paper, and then I moved on. So just be aware of that when you're trying to lift up your masks. The reason that I used my tweezers for the rest of the masks is because I have on darker nail polish, and I don't want to streak my nail polish across the front of my card. Most of the time when I'm coloring with alcohol markers, I like to use a 4-color blend, a highlight, 2 midtones, and a shadow color. My original intention when I started coloring this image was that I would make some of the petals brighter and some of them darker, but then I fall into the same trap that I always do, which is I don't feel like there's enough dimension, and so I end up adding that shadow color to everything. And so I did use the 5 colors, but you certainly don't have to. In the pink combination, I would probably get rid of the RV06. So I would use the RV02, 4, 9, and then 69. For the yellow green combination that you'll see later on when we do the leaves, I would probably leave out the G05. So I would do the YG01, YG03, or no, I'm sorry, not the G05, the G17. I leave out the 17. So YG01, YG03, G05, and then into the G28. And I feel like those would blend well and not give you any issues. So the way that I do Copic coloring is I start with my lightest color, I work out to my darkest, and then from my darkest back into my lightest. I find that this gives me the best blend. I'm also blessed, but that's not the word I meant to say. It just, that's what works for me. I know I'm very heavy-handed, so I cannot start with my darkest color. If I start with my darkest color, I will have no highlight. And that's just something that I've learned through practice over the years for how I color. But you may have more self-control with your colors than I do, and may totally be able to start with the darkest color and then, you know, go up to your lightest and not have any blending issues. But this is what works for me. You want to use a super light hand. The tip of your marker should barely be touching your page. There really shouldn't be any pressure being applied at all. That's where you're going to get your bleeding or more color down than you want. So just go super lightly. If you're having trouble going really lightly, back up your hand on your marker. This kind of forces you to have a looser grip if you're trying to color from the middle of the marker versus right at the tip. It forces you to have a lighter hand until you can train yourself to have a much lighter hand. The flicking technique for me tends to be kind of my go-to. I like the way that it creates that little bit of texture and the way that it blends the markers. But there are other ones. There's small circles or filling it in with your lightest color all together in the beginning. There's a couple of different ways to do it. This is just my version. There is no right or wrong way. It's just really whatever works for you. As far as knowing where to put your shadows, this I think is the #1 challenge for people who are first learning how to color and they want dimensional images. They're not sure where to put the shadows. Leave the light source out of it, at least for the beginning. Super easy way to know where to put your shadows is if it's a point where 2 objects meet, there's going to be a shadow. And if there is a point where one object lays on top of another, there's going to be a shadow. So when you're looking at this particular flower, the center of it has all of these petals laying on top of it. So that's going to be much darker than the outside petals. Also, where the petals are all interconnected, so where they're meeting each other, there's going to be a lot more shadow there than there would be on the tips where they're all kind of separated. So those are just two really easy ways right out the gate when you're practicing to know where to put your light and dark areas. Now, again, you'll see when I'm going through the first time that I leave lots of white. And I leave lots of white because, as I said, I'm very heavy-handed. And so I have to give myself that grace so that I will have a highlight at the end of the coloring. If something happens where you maybe get a darker color up higher than you want, don't forget, like, that's why God made the colorless blender. Or in this case, especially with the pinks, with the RVs, the lightest color, this RVO2, really bleaches out the darker colors. So you may be able to take that RVO2 and just go right over the tip of your petal and pull out enough color that you still have a highlight. If none of that works for you, a guaranteed way to put your highlight back into your images is a white gel pen. Or if you want something that's really going to like bring that dimension up another notch, add your highlights with a white gel pen. And you'll see more toward the end of the video that I am going to do that on my flowers, and you'll be able to see the difference from having one done to the other two that don't. So basically we're pretty much done coloring up the main portion of the flower, and we're going to move on to the leaves. For all of my images, I usually, if I don't know what they look like, so for Protea, I think they're native to South Africa. I don't have any. I have not really ever seen them before. I think they're beautiful flowers, but I'm not sure what colors they came in. So before I even started coloring or even started putting my card together, I just Googled them. I Googled the name of the image, and then I looked at a bunch of, real life still images to see what color my leaves should be, to see what color my flowers should be. And that's something that's always been super helpful to me for getting my image right. So they do have more of a true green leaf color, but I like a little bit of my highlight to be like a yellow green, so that's how I picked my color combination. And I'm following the same rules as I did with the flowers, which is any point where one lays on top of another. So like this top left leaf is kind of curling over itself, so where it's curling over is going to be darker because the outside of the leaf is laying on the inside of the leaf. The stems, where the flower bud is laying on top of the stem, that's going to be darker. But the tips of the leaves will be lightest because it's not meeting anything and it is not nothing's laying on top of it. So that's where the majority of the highlight's going to be. I colored them all the same way, but you can see that blank spot in the center of the leaves. And that's where my masking was. I ended up just adding shading there, some darker shading there to make it look like a leaf, and I was able to cover that up. In these images, they have some areas where the leaves meet other leaves, and I wasn't going to cut all those out. Also, if you ever have a misaligned mask, a simple way to fix that is to just find a Copic color that matches and fill those in. For me, it was a BO2, and I just filled them in and it worked beautifully. Here's adding that white highlight, so you'll be able to see when I'm done here, this flower will have the really bold white highlights and the other two won't, and it just makes it look so much more dimensional. I did add it to all of them eventually. And then this is totally optional. All of it's optional, honestly, but that's something that I like to do, is to outline all of my images. I just really love a bold black outline. And I just use Copic safe pens to do that. Also, to make the image, because it is flat, a little bit more dimensional, I'm going to add what they call a drop shadow. So if your light source is in the top right-hand corner, all of your shadows will be in your bottom left. If your light source is in the top left-hand corner, all of your shadows will be to the bottom right. I always use top right light source, but because that's what I learned in art school and high school, and that's just kind of carried with me, and it's the one I'm the most comfortable doing. I started with my darkest color closest to my flowers and then worked out to 2 lighter colors to blend it into the background. To kind of make that pink pop, I'm going to put it on some pink cardstock. I am going to pop it up on some foam tape just to, again, add a little bit of interest because it is a flat image. So I'm just going to cover this in foam tape and then, pull off the little backer pieces. I find that it's easiest for me to line up my images if I turn them horizontal so that I can see both sides of both lines to make sure they're even. This particular one did not go well for me. I was doing something else while I was trying to line the card up. So since I hadn't pushed it down yet, I was able to pull it back up and then realign it so that it was straight. I'm using some black cardstock here for my sentiment. I'm going to do some white heat embossing. So I'm going to treat that with my anti-static tool. I'm going to stamp it down in Versamark ink, which, if you're unfamiliar, is just a clear sticky ink. And this particular sentiment, there's great sentiments in this set, just like everyday ones, wishing you a beautiful day, just for you. But then there's also a feel better, and this one says sending love and sympathy. My neighbor recently lost her mother, and so I wanted to drop her off a card on her porch just to send my condolences. So this sentiment was perfect for me. I originally cut the sentiment into a label, but it just felt kind of clunky. So I decided that I was going to fussy cut around it so it's more the shape of the sentiment. And then I chose to put it on the right-hand side because it felt like that was a little bit empty up there. So I'm just going to fill it in with that sentiment. And again, I'm going to pop that up on some foam tape. So while the masking and the image is one layer, the rest of the card is not. And I found that this is a good way to kind of mix up my design since I do love one layer cards so much. So then once I put the sentiment on, that's pretty much it. That's the whole card. So I hope that you were inspired to try something that you have seen here. Thank you guys so much for joining me and for Hero for having me, and I will catch you on the next video. Bye.